The New Kid. It's a bright, sunny day. The kind of day that makes you feel like you have to do something. You have to do something fun, or you have to be productive. Devin used his left index and middle fingers to make air quotes, trusting no one would notice his chewed-on cuticles and bitten-down nails. Then he continued in what he hoped was an ominous tone. It's the kind of day when your mom makes you mow the lawn. But today isn't a mowing day. Today is a birthday party day. Devin heard rustling in the classroom. Someone snickered, but he didn't look up from his papers. He kept his head bent, his long hair hanging like a protective shield between him and the class. Normally, he hated having to stand in front of the class, for any reason, but today he was on a mission. If he had to read a stupid assignment for English class, he was going to make it work for him. Devin continued with his story, describing the birthday party scene for a pack of screaming 4-year-olds. He read about the balloons and the clowns and the bright-colored bounce house set up in the middle of the green lawn. But this isn't any ordinary bounce house, Devin read. No one knows that yet, but they're going to find out now. Devin paused for effect. He didn't hear anything. For all he knew, his teacher, Mrs. Patterson, and his classmates had disappeared. But he wasn't going to look up and see. Devin went on, because now little Hallie is crawling into the bounce house. She's the first one in. Her twin sister, Hope, is right behind her. Was that a gasp Devin heard from the third row of desks? He thought it was. Good. He had their attention. He grinned as he kept reading. Hallie makes it almost all of the way into the bounce house, her bright pink dress clashing with the house's puffy red vinyl floor. Faster, Hope urges Hallie, pushing Hallie's butt. Hallie still crawls slowly, until suddenly she's sucked inside the bounce house. Hope giggles and follows her. Devin stopped reading again. He was getting to the good part. But in a second, Hope is going to wish she didn't follow her sister. In just a second, she's looking down as she crawls inside, but now she's in. She looks up, and she sees her sister's partially eaten body lying still on the red vinyl. No, wait. The vinyl isn't red. It's covered in blood. Was that a squeal Devin just heard? He kept reading. And the house isn't a house. It's a big mouth, and the mouth is chewing, and now it's opening wider, and Hope, now screaming, is sliding into— "That's enough," Mrs. Patterson shouted. Devin blinked. He still didn't look up. He wasn't finished. "Devin Blaine Marks," Mrs. Patterson spurted every one of Devin's 3 names like it was a spitball. Before he could respond, Mrs. Patterson's large square hand appeared in front of Devin's downward-aimed gaze and snatched the story from his grasp. The pages rattled, and he felt the sting of a paper cut on the web of skin between his thumb and index fingers. The classroom was so silent Devin could hear a bird chirping outside the window. He finally looked up at Mrs. Patterson. "What?" "What?" Mrs. Patterson shook her head, sending her blonde ponytail into a wild dance. Mrs. Patterson was an English teacher, but she was also the girls' basketball coach. She was a huge woman, tall and broad in the shoulders. She towered over Devin, and Devin was already 5'9", tall for his age. If only he were coordinated enough to be a basketball player. Maybe then he'd be a part of— Devin. Mrs. Patterson softened her deep voice, and Devin finally raised his gaze to look at her wide face. He even managed to meet her intense blue eyes. Mrs. Patterson's eyes were scary. Everyone in the class thought so. She could reduce you to a pile of smoke and ashes with just a look. Devin was happy he was still standing. "Report to Mr. Wright's office," Mrs. Patterson ordered. Devin looked at his story, crumpled in Mrs. Patterson's hand. He wanted to argue, but he shrugged and headed toward the classroom door. Heather sat in the second seat from the door, in the 3rd row. As he passed that row, he met her gaze. Had it worked? Heather was looking right at him. Looking right at him, yes. Heather Anders, one of the most popular girls in his class, and by far the prettiest, had never, not one single time, ever looked at Devin. As far as Heather and pretty much all their 9th grade class was concerned, Devin didn't exist. Or, if she hadn't noticed he existed, he was nothing more than part of the scenery, like a blackboard or a chair. If it wasn't for Devin's best and only friend, Mick, and his well-meaning but annoying mom, Devin would wonder if he did, in fact, exist. Sometimes he wasn't so sure. But today, he existed. And Heather saw him. Triumphant, he grinned at her and gave her a thumbs up as he sauntered toward the classroom door. Heather rolled her eyes and said, "Geez, Devin, that was sick." Devin grinned wider and stood tall as he nodded at her, and then strode out of the classroom like he was heading to an important meeting instead of to the principal's office. He'd done it. Even though Heather never noticed Devin, he'd made a careful study of Heather. He watched her. He listened to her. He wanted to know everything about her. The previous week, while Mick was going on about his latest superhero obsession, Devin was listening to Heather talk to her girlfriends. She was complaining about her 4-year-old twin sisters, Hallie and Hope. "They drive me crazy," she told Valerie, her best friend. "I mean, seriously bonkers. I'm always having to babysit them, and I hate it. They're always getting into trouble, breaking something or whatever, and then I get into trouble. I hate them." That same day, Mrs. Patterson handed out the assignment to write an original short story. That's when Devin saw his chance. He saw it, he took it, and he'd made the most of it. Who cared if it cost him a trip to the principal's office? The best creative artists had hidden depths lurking underneath the surface, and usually those depths were misunderstood. Devin and Mick met up after school at their regular spot in the back, at the edge of the teacher's parking lot. Devin couldn't wait to talk to Mick about what had happened with Heather. He hadn't thought to look at Mick before he left English class. He wasn't sure his friend saw what happened. Mick tended to daydream. He was often caught staring out the school windows at who knew what. When Devin reached Mick, Mick was juggling his bright purple backpack, a papier-mâché tiger, a plastic go-cup with a curly straw, a stack of books that obviously wouldn't fit in the overstuffed backpack, and a half-eaten package of chocolate cupcakes. White frosting from the missing cupcake was stuck to his lower lip. Devin pointed at the frosting. "Huh? What?" "Oh." Mike wiped it at his mouth with the back of his hand, holding the tiger. It made him look like he was being mauled. It also made him drop the stack of books, which smacked the ground and scattered. Devin shook his head and bent over to pick them up. He stuck them in his own navy blue backpack, which was nearly empty. He'd already done his homework for the day while he was hanging out in Mr. Wright's office, and unlike Mick, Devin never read a book he wasn't required to read. "Sorry. Oh, you got those?" Mick asked. "Thanks." Mick squinted at Devin through his round, wire-rimmed glasses. He shoved his reddish-blonde bangs off his freckled forehead. They ended up sticking straight up. "Where's your art project?" "I dumped it in the trash." "Why? That 4-headed octopus was gnarly." Devin shrugged. He didn't tell Mick that he thought making papier-mâché animals was for kids, and that the art teacher, Mr. Stewart, had given Devin a D on the project and a lecture on following instructions instead of doing whatever he wanted. "These are supposed to be representations of real animals, Mr. Marks," Mr. Stewart had said. "How do you know there aren't any 4-headed octopuses?" Devin had responded. "Only 5% of the ocean floor has been explored." That had shut Mr. Stewart up. Devin didn't like reading books, but that didn't mean he didn't read. He spent most of his spare time on the internet. Mick stuffed the second cupcake in his mouth. The boys started walking away from the school. Mick took a noisy slurp from his straw. "That was a skeevy short story, Dev. Kinda made me throw up in my mouth." Devin gave Mick a gentle shove. "Gross. No grosser than your story." "Whatever. Did you see what Heather did, though? She was, like, really white. Her face, I mean. I thought she was gonna faint." "Yeah, but did you see her look at me?" Mick glanced at Devin, who bent down to pick up a round stone. He flung it at a stop sign, and it hit the middle of the O with a resounding metal clink. I saw her look at you like she wanted to kill you." "Nah, didn't you hear what she said?" Mick adjusted his backpack. "Yep, she said the story was sick." "No, she said it was sick, as in cool." Mick screwed up his round face. I don't think so." Devin shrugged again, picked up another rock, and fired it at a lamppost. He got a resonant bong as a reward. "The point is, she noticed me. She talked to me." Mick twisted his small mouth. "That's something?" "It sure is." The boys had reached the railroad yard that was half a mile from their school. They began weaving through the stationary, graffiti-covered boxcars. The railway yard smelled like oil and creosote, and it was filled with the sounds of train wheels clunking lethargically over dirty old rails. At the far side of the yard, the boys ducked into the woods that stretched for miles to the north beyond the railroad yard, and from several miles east of the yard to the back of their neighborhood to the west. The woods were thick with huge fir and hemlock trees that stood so closely together in places that they blocked out the sun, creating perpetual dusk. On a cloudy day, the forest was even darker, like it was one big shadow engulfing and muting the too loud, too bright, too busy craziness that most people called real life. Devin loved the darkness, and on a sunny day like today, it was a relief to duck into the trees and leave the blazing light behind. Halfway from the railroad yard to the neighborhood, if they stayed near the edge of the woods, they'd reach their clubhouse, the hangout they had set up in an old abandoned gas station that backed onto the woods. For the 6 years they had been friends, they'd spent nearly every afternoon after school and much of every weekend in their clubhouse. If Devin was being honest, which he wasn't, he thought they were getting a little old to have a clubhouse. It was fine when they were in grade school and maybe even last year in middle school, but now that they were nearly at the end of their freshman year, it was too little kid for them. Devin had outgrown their pretend games of pirates and space cowboys, and he no longer saw the collections of junk they'd amassed over the years as treasures. He didn't want to be one of the 2 boys who had no place to go after school other than a tumbling down empty gas station. But that didn't mean he had a problem with their clubhouse. It might not be little kid fun for him anymore, but it was a place to get away from all the crap of real life. It was a place he could go and forget about school and forget about all the pressure his mom was putting on him to be somebody. "Don't end up like me, Devin. Be somebody," she told him, over and over and over and... "Don't you think?" Mick asked. "What?" How long had he been walking along, not listening to his friend? Devin had no idea what he'd missed, but he figured it probably wasn't important. Mick's latest favorite subject of conversation was the digital math game he was working on. "It's going to be like playing Spy with ciphers," Mick had explained to Devin. Mick and Devin got mostly B's and C's, peppered with the occasional D at school. That wasn't, however, because they were stupid. They weren't. Devin just never cared enough about school to apply himself. His mother's words. School bored him. Why work hard at it? Mick's problem was a little more serious. He had some learning disorders that Devin didn't really understand, and he tended to have attention issues. "We're not going to label the boy," Mick's father said, according to Mick. So, Mick had ever been treated for anything. Basically, as far as Devin could tell, Mick was like a savant who couldn't figure out how to play the school game. And Mick didn't care about the school game. He was in love with food, the reason for his soft, slightly pudgy form, and fantasy worlds of any kind. Mick was an overgrown kid, almost as tall as Devin. Mick's high-waisted corduroy pants and button-down short-sleeve shirts screamed nerd, but it didn't seem to bother him. Devin figured someday Mick would probably own a gaming company and be a zillionaire. "Devin!" Mick yanked on Devin's t-shirt sleeve. "What?" Mick blinked and looked around. They should be at the clubhouse by now. Yep, there was the old cedar tree with the split trunk, so... where was the gas station? "It's gone," Mick said, in a very small voice. He was right. The gas station was no longer there. In its place, a hulking yellow backhoe sat idled next to a mass of debris, like a dragon waiting to spew fire at its defeated foe. Mick plopped down on a fallen log. "But..." He blinked and sniffed. "Our treasures." Devin, who was feeling strangely thrilled by the demolished clubhouse, looked down at his friend. Mick's large brown eyes were moist. He rubbed his nose. Devin took a seat next to Mick and threw an arm around his shoulders. "Hey, it's okay." "But it's not, look." "Yeah, I'm looking." "All our treasures," Mick repeated. "Yeah, but we can find more." Not that Devin wanted to, but Mick didn't need to know that. "But we have no clubhouse now." Devin gave Mick a half hug, glad no one could see them. "I'll find us something." "You think so?" "Sure, and in the meantime, we'll have the forest." He waved an arm behind him. "Well, yeah, that'll work on days like today, but..." "Leave it to me," Devin said. "For now, let's just hang out here. No matter what, we're in it together, right?" He held out his right index finger. Mick grinned and nodded. In it together. He extended his right index finger and linked it with Devin's. They both pulled hard and then released. Devin shrugged out of his backpack and unzipped the outer pocket. "I saved the chocolate chip cookie for my lunch. It's yours if you want it." Mick brightened. "Really? Far out." Devin inwardly rolled his eyes. He was used to Mick's habit of using out-of-date or even made-up slang, but that didn't mean he always liked it. While Mick munched on a cookie, Devin said, "I think today's a big day. Maybe that," he waved at the pile of the destroyed gas station, "is a sign that something new is coming. Something big. I mean, after all, Heather talked to me today. All I have to do now is build on that and figure out other ways to get her attention." Mick stopped chewing. He brushed cookie crumbs off his chin. I'm not sure getting her attention is necessarily a good thing. There are different kinds of attention, right?" Devin shrugged. "Whatever." Devin was happy with how his plan unfolded today. He wasn't going to let Mick talk him off his high. "Hey," he said, "why don't we go poke around that pile and see if we can find some of our stuff?" Mick, who had finished the cookie, grinned. Mrs. Patterson seemed to be bearing a grudge about Devon's story. Instead of ignoring him like usual, she glared at him as he took his usual place in the back of the room next to Mick. Heather wasn't here yet. As soon as Devon sat down, Mick leaned over and poked him in the arm. "Hey, Dev, you need to meet Kelsey." Mick leaned back and pointed at a new kid sitting on Mick's left. "Kelsey, this is Devon. Dev, this is Kelsey." "Hey," Kelsey said. He flashed Devon what looked like a genuine friendly smile. "Really?" Devon had spotted Kelsey earlier that morning. He'd been hanging out near the stairs watching the other kids. Both then and now, Devon thought Kelsey didn't look like the kind of kid who'd be friendly with Mick and Devon. Although Devon didn't dress with nerdy abandon like Mick did, he in no way resembled a normal kid. Too skinny for his height, Devon knew he had a lot of things working against him. His teeth were super crooked, and his mom couldn't afford to get him braces. His ears were too big. Even though he wore his dark hair long and messy as he could, his ears still wanted to stick out. His neck was too long, and his dark eyes were way too small and way too close together. When he was in grade school, one of the school bullies called him Birdman. His mom liked to say he was a dormant swan. Yeah, whatever. But here there was this new kid, this very good-looking, Devon knew what girls looked for in boys, new kid, smiling at Devon as if Devon were someone worth smiling at. Devon had seen Kelsey smile at lots of kids the same way when he was on the stairs. Kelsey's smile made Devon feel ridiculously good. "Kelsey just moved here," Mick said. Devon resisted the urge to say, "Duh." "His dad's a contractor," Mick continued. "He's here to head up that hotel/office complex my dad bid on and didn't get." His grin and bright eyes made it clear he didn't intend any spite in these words. Even so, Devon noticed Kelsey's smile faltered for a second. Devon had no idea what to say to that, so he just said, "Okay." It was bad enough that Mick had just mentioned his often out-of-work dad, who liked to grouse about how other electricians were always outbidding him. But Devon hoped this conversation wasn't going to end up with him having to say what his mom did. She was a house cleaner. She didn't even have her own house cleaning business. She worked for someone else. She barely made enough money for them to live on, but she seemed to think he should be proud that they were making it. He wasn't. "I invited Kelsey to sit with us at lunch," Mick said. "Sure," Devon said, not at all sure Kelsey would actually want to sit with them. Kelsey grinned. "I appreciate the invite." Devon raised an eyebrow and scanned Kelsey's wavy blonde hair, blue eyes, straight teeth, broad shoulders, cool ripped jeans, and faded black t-shirt. "Sure," he repeated. The disjointed sound of multiple conversations, the swish of clothes, the scraping of chairs, and the thudding of books on desks let Devon know the classroom was filling up. He got a whiff of Heather's lemony scent, and he swiveled in his chair to stare at the sleek shine of her straight hair. She was wearing a dark green shirt that went great with her hair. "Okay, cease and desist with the chaos," Mrs. Patterson said. "Let's begin." To Devon's shock, Kelsey did actually sit with Mick and him during lunch. It was another bright day, and everyone was outside, either clustered at the picnic table set up near the entrance to the cafeteria, or lounging on the grass that stretched from the walkway in front of the school to the parking lot. Devon and Mick leaned against the base of the stone wall surrounding the flag posts. The stone was rough but warm. Devon was looking for Heather, and Mick was going on about how delicious peanut butter and honey sandwiches were, when Kelsey strolled over to them and dropped to a cross-legged position. Devon glanced up and around them to see if anyone was looking at this shocking social development. Several people were. A couple of the jocks called out, "Hey, Kelsey," as they strutted past. Kelsey smiled at them. "Hey, Kurt. Hey, Brian." He also waved at a group of girls at the closest picnic table, and they waved back. Then he turned his attention to Mick and Devon. "I hear the food sucks here, so I brought my own lunch," he said. Mick waved around his delicious sandwich and said in peanut butter mush mouth, "It's the best choice." Kelsey laughed. He actually laughed, not like as if he were laughing at Mick, but like he thought Mick was amusing. He opened a crumpled brown paper bag. "I like good old chicken salad," he said. "My mom makes great chicken salad." He gestured at Devon's sack. "What do you have?" Devon shrugged. "I'm not actually hungry." He pushed his sack down into his backpack. The truth was that he had bologna on white bread. His mom bought both in bulk, and he hated both. He hated the taste, and he hated that they reminded him of grade school when he thought bologna was the best thing in the world. He'd outgrown the food, but their budget hadn't kept up with his taste buds. Kelsey bit into his sandwich and looked around. "I like it here. I like the sun." "See, Dev, normal people like the sun." Mick nudged Devon with a foot and said to Kelsey, Dev likes clouds. If I didn't know better, I'd think he was a vampire. Kelsey tilted his head and studied Devin for a couple seconds. For those 2 seconds, Devin had the weird feeling he was being evaluated. But then Kelsey laughed and leaned toward Devin. Well, he doesn't sparkle in the sun like those movie vampires. He laughed again. Probably not a vampire. Devin said in a creepy vampire accent, I don't want to suck your blood. Hey, Kelsey, a girl's voice called out. Devin sat up straight. It was Heather. Hi, Heather, Kelsey said. Did you find that book I was telling you about? She stood a few feet from them and beamed down at Kelsey. I did. I'm going to start it tonight. She flicked a glance at Mike and Devin. Mick and Devin. Oh, hi, Devin. The tone of Heather's voice when she said hi to Devin was totally different than the one she used for Kelsey. Devin noticed that, of course. Part of his brain told him that the sharp and heavy tones in each syllable of his name represented sarcasm. Part of his brain didn't care. It only cared that she said hi to him. Hi, Heather. She wrinkled her nose at him, flashed a big smile at Kelsey, and walked away. Pretty girl, Kelsey said softly after Heather had moved off. He watched her for a few seconds, then scanned the rest of the students, his gaze resting now and then on someone before moving on. Yeah, Mick said. Devin thinks, yes, she is, Devin interrupted. He turned and gave Mick a look that clearly said, shut up. Mick was sharp enough to quietly return to his sandwich. Kelsey started talking about the experiment they'd done in science class, and Devin tuned out. He watched Heather talking animately with her friends while he half listened to Kelsey and Mick discuss chemical reagents. Was this what it was like to actually fit in? Maybe not quite, but it was closer than he'd gotten in years. Devin pretty much floated through the rest of the day. He hadn't felt this good in a long time. He even raised his hand once in math and answered a question correctly. Mr. Crenshaw's mouth dropped open. On his way through the school to meet Mick after his last class, Devin passed Heather and her friends loitering by the lockers. Heather stood with her back to the hallway. Her friends formed a semicircle in front of her. There was Valerie and Juliet, along with her third friend, Gabriella. Gabriella's boyfriend, Quincy, also stood nearby. For some reason Devin didn't understand, Quincy always seemed to be hanging out with the three girls. I've decided I'm going to make my own movies. Heather flung her hair back over her shoulder. I don't want to be an actress. I want to be behind the camera. Devin didn't think. Ignoring Heather's friends, he pushed in sideways in front of Heather and said, if you're going to make movies, you should do horror movies. Even campy horror movies can get good followings. Heather took a step back and looked Devin up and down. He kept talking. If you decide to do horror movies, let me know. I have a cousin who has clown makeup and costumes. You could do a creepy clown story. Heather tapped a finger against Devin's chest. Emphasizing every word with what could have been scorn, but maybe not, she pronounced, You are unoriginal. That's been done. She turned and flounced off. Her friends followed, but not before Valerie, her blonde curls bouncing as she shook her head at Devin, said, You are very weird. Devin watched them walk away as he rubbed the spot Heather touched. She touched him. As Mick and Devin headed away from school, Mick waited for Devin to talk about his search for a new clubhouse. But Devin didn't talk about that. She actually touched me, Devin was saying. He'd just finished telling Mick how he'd talked to Heather in the hall. It sounded to Mick like Devin had made himself look like a total doofus, but Devin didn't see it that way. Devin actually thought Heather's comment was worth getting excited about. Mick was a little worried about Devin. It seemed like he was getting just a bit delusional. It wasn't that Mick thought Devin didn't deserve to get her attention. Sure he did. Mick's parents had taught him that looks didn't mean anything, and everyone is equally deserving of love and other good stuff. Mick had to admit he wasn't really sure the world worked that way. He hadn't seen evidence of this attitude in school for sure, but he trusted his parents. A bee buzzed past Mick's nose, and he jumped back and waved his go-cup in front of his face. The liquid inside sloshed around. He watched Devin throw a rock at the coupling on the end of one of the boxcars. He hit it dead on. But he was missing big time with his conclusions about Heather. Devin's latest controversial attempt was a swing and a very, very big miss. Mick grinned. His dad would be proud of the sports metaphor. Mick hadn't liked sports when he was younger. But lately he'd been getting into baseball, which his dad loved. Mick liked the stats. As Mick and Devin ducked into the woods, Mick said, Dev, what's going on with looking for a new clubhouse? Huh? Devin had been talking about Heather's hair. He blinked and looked at Mick. A new clubhouse? Mick repeated. Oh, right, I'm still looking for something good, but in the meantime I stashed a blanket, a tarp, and some ropes in the woods early this morning. I thought we could build a fort and make it look like our camp. Mick grinned. but donk-a-donk, that's the boss. Mick noticed Devin sigh. He knew Devin didn't like his expressions, but he didn't care. They made Mick happy, and Mick liked to do whatever he could to be happy. He was pretty sure Devin thought Mick didn't care about fitting in at school, but Mick did care. He cared so much it actually hurt him to think about how much everyone ignored them both. But the alternative, putting themselves out there and being rejected, was decidedly something Mick didn't want. He and Devin both used to deal with it in the same way, by ignoring everyone else and doing their own thing. Now Devin seemed to want to fit in, while Mick still wanted to try to stay in his fantasy world. The fantasy world felt good. The real world definitely did not. A few minutes later, they reached a small stand of hemlock sheltering a couple of boulders. Devin went to one of the boulders and pulled out a blanket, a tarp, and some rope. Between the two of them, they managed to string up the tarp to form a lopsided and sagging roof, and they spread the blanket on the ground between the boulders. "So, let's brainstorm," Dev said, when they'd settled, and Mick had offered him a barbecue potato chip from the bag he brought from the vending machine after school. Every day, his mom gave him money to get some kind of junk food from the machine. It was his reward for getting through another day. Some days he got something sugary, and when he did, he usually ate it immediately. Some days he got something salty, and he usually saved that to share with Devin. "About the clubhouse?" Mick asked. "Is that what we're brainstorming?" Devin crunched a chip and said, "What? No, about how Heather and how I can get in with her more." Dude, I'm still not sure you're getting it with her yet." Devin ignored Mick. "I need to find a way to impress her." "That's never a good idea," Mick said. "What isn't?" "Doing something to try to impress someone. My mom says that's when people make stupid mistakes." Devin flicked a rock at a fern growing at the base of one of the trees holding up their tarp. "Well, who cares what your mom says?" I do." "Yeah, well, you shouldn't." "How about we talk about the hike we're going to do on Saturday," Mick said. "Dad says if we go a couple miles further north than we normally go, we'll find a pretty cool waterfall." "Maybe we should scout out locations for her movies," Devin said. "I could give her a list of good locations. That should make her happy." "Apparently there's some kind of rare plant that grows next to the waterfall." Mick tried again. "It would be cool beans to find it." "Why would Heather want beans?" Devin said. Mick laughed, but then he realized Devin was being serious. He hadn't been listening to anything Mick said. Mick sighed. It was just like Devin had been put under a witch's spell. Mick wondered how he could break it. To Devin's amazement, Kelsey met Devin and Mick for lunch again the next day. He even brought his new friend chicken salad sandwiches. "I thought you'd like to try them," Kelsey said. "Mom makes her own bread, too. It's pretty awesome." Today the weather was more to Devin's liking. So many cloud tufts clustered overhead as they blocked out most of the sun. "Hey," Kelsey said, jerking his thumb toward the sky. "Your kind of weather." He remembered that? Devin smiled. "Yeah." Devin had watched Kelsey in the 2 classes they shared. It seemed like Kelsey was making friends with every kid in the class. How did he do that? Was it just because he was good looking? Was it the clothes? Today he wore baggy black pants with a gray t-shirt. He had a black and red plaid shirt tied at his waist. Devin had never cared about clothes enough to know what was right and what was wrong to wear. There was no reason to care. His mom could afford to get him 2 pairs of jeans and a bunch of t-shirts every year. That limited his fashion choices. "So, do you know all the cloud types?" Kelsey asked. "We learned them in school last year, and the only one I can remember is stratus. What are those?" He gestured overhead. "Cumulus," Devin said without thinking. Maybe that was it. Kelsey talked to you like he actually cared about what you were into. Did he really care, or was it an act? Devin narrowed his eyes and studied Kelsey as Kelsey asked Mick about Mick's superhero watch. "I saw that latest movie," Kelsey said. "It was dope." Kelsey was starting to get on Devin's nerves. "Wait a minute. What? Why?" Devin frowned. Why was Kelsey bugging him? He should be glad the new kid was hanging out with him. He was glad. But he was annoyed, too. It just came so easily to Kelsey. Too easily. It wasn't fair. Devin snorted. Mick and Kelsey looked at him. "What?" Mick said. "Oh, sorry, just had a stupid thought. Not important." Kelsey cocked his head and looked at Devin so hard it felt like Kelsey was looking into his soul. Then Kelsey grinned and nodded as if he understood exactly. But how could he? "Don't you just hate it when your brain goes and comes up with stupid thoughts? Mine does that all the time," Kelsey said. "It's like it has a mind of its own," he laughed. Mick laughed, too. "Brain has a mind of its own. That's a good one." Devin forced a chuckle. "Yeah." He actually had been laughing at himself because he'd sound like a baby when he thought it wasn't fair. As if. By now, he of all people should know life wasn't fair. "What do you guys do after school?" Kelsey asked. "I've been looking into what's available, and I haven't decided what to get into yet." Devin didn't want to answer that question. He and Mick weren't involved in any sports or clubs, except their club of two. They had nothing. Mick wasn't intimidated by the question. With naive honesty, he said, "We had this clubhouse, this really cool hangout in an abandoned gas station, but they tore it down. Dev said he's going to look for a new place for us." Kelsey finished his sandwich and wiped his mouth with a black napkin. Who used black napkins? "A hangout?" He leaned forward. "Well, the best places for hangouts are abandoned buildings. My friends and I at my last school really got into urban exploring. We found some cool spots. When I learned I was coming here, I asked one of my buddies to let me know if there's anything worth checking out. He's looking into it." "Cool," Mick said. "But until then, I can help with the hangout thing." "You can?" Mick finished his sandwich too, but didn't wipe off the chicken salad smeared on his cheek. Kelsey pointed at it, and without making fun, he said, "You got a little smudge there." "Oh, thanks." Mick wiped his face with the back of his hand. Kelsey smiled. "My parents bought this huge old farmhouse right outside of town. Mom says it's historical or something. I don't care about that, but I do like that there's this big old workshop behind the house. It's a mess, like sagging and starting to fall apart, and it needs paint and a new roof and stuff. Dad's building a home office and shop on the other side of the house, so he said I could have the workshop for a hangout place for parties and whatever if I fix it up. Want to help me? Dad said he'd buy all the supplies, I just have to do the work. He's taught me, so I know how to build things, but it's more fun with friends. We could redo the workshop and make it our hangout." Did he really just say it's fun with friends? Devin was tempted to stab Kelsey and see if he was a robot. Kids just didn't say stuff like that. Mick didn't seem to have a problem with it. He was practically bouncing. "That's the bee's knees." Kelsey laughed. "Glad you think so." He grinned at Devin. "How about you?" "Knees," Devin said, as dryly as possible. But he smiled. "That does sound pretty great." And it did. Even though he resented how easily Kelsey was sliding into their class, he had to admit it would be awesome if being friends with Kelsey got him a ticket into their inner circle. If they helped build the hangout and Kelsey had parties, they'd be invited. "Great," Kelsey said. He pulled out his phone and sent a text. "There's this old guy, George, a neighbor I've made friends with. I just texted him to see if I can take us to the building supply store after school tomorrow. He told me he could drive me whenever I needed it." A couple seconds later, Kelsey's phone played a guitar riff. He glanced at it. "Yep, he's in." He glanced at his watch and stood. Mick and Devin stood too. It was time to get to class. "Meet us tomorrow after school by the flagpoles," Kelsey said. "Dad has a big dually pickup truck with an empty cab. Plenty of room for us all. It's bright red, you won't be able to miss it." "Capital, my man," Mick said in a fake British accent. Kelsey laughed and offered Mick a fist to bump. "Jolly good." He played along. He offered his fist to Devin too. Devin bumped it and said "see ya" as they went into the school. He noticed and ignored the flutter in his belly as he got his books from his locker. He was excited about Kelsey's offer, but he wasn't sure that was a good idea to get too revved up about it. Life had a way of disappointing him. Maybe things were going to turn around, though. As Heather swished past him and he gave him a chilly stare, he let himself believe in the possibility of change. Mick was so hyped up he could barely sit still. He hadn't been able to sleep since the night before because he was too excited about helping Kelsey build the new clubhouse. Hangouts, clubhouse, hangout, whatever. His mom had noticed Mick had dark circles under his eyes when he got up, so she let him have a cup of coffee. Now, he was on a caffeine high. He talked Evan's ear off on the way to school, and in every class, his leg had bounced like a basketball dribbled by a pro. Whoa, there was another sports metaphor. And he didn't even like basketball. How about that? It was the third period of the day. They were in social studies. Not his favorite class, but he'd endure. As usual, Mick and Devin sat in the back of the classroom with the map-lined walls and the stern Mr. Gentry looming over the kids in the front row. Mick noticed Kelsey was at the end of the third row, sitting next to a couple of football players. Kelsey was leaning back in his chair sideways, so he was looking at the kids on the left side of the room instead of at Mr. Gentry up front. Mick watched as Kelsey's gaze landed on Devin and Mick. Kelsey gave them a little half smile and nodded. "Today," Mr. Gentry said, "we're talking about justice." He peered over his black, thick-rimmed reading glasses, which generally hung at the end of his beaky nose. Mick thought Mr. Gentry looked a little like an eagle. He had white hair, and he usually wore brown. He had close-set eyes like Devon did, and then there was that nose. "What is justice?" Mr. Gentry asked. No one raised their hands. I know a rhetorical question when I hear one, Mick thought. Every culture has its own concept of justice, Mr. Gentry continued. This concept is generally derived from many fields of study. Our system of justice, for example, comes from ethics, rational thought, the law, religion, and just general ideas about fairness. Underlying all of that, though, is usually some kind of gut feeling. Justice is, in most cases, intuitive. We know it when we feel it. He looked out over the class. So what does justice mean to you? This wasn't a rhetorical question. Mick didn't even think about raising his hand, though. Raising his hand in class would require that he have a brain transplant, or maybe get possessed or be infected by an alien symbiont. Kelsey raised his hand and said, "Justice balances the scales." "What does that mean?" Mr. Gentry asked. "It removes the downside, so the downside can't outweigh the upside." "Interesting perspective," Mr. Gentry said. Heather raised her hand. Mick frowned. Heather. What was it about Heather that fascinated Devon so much? Sure, she was pretty, but she seemed pretty shallow to Mick. And she wasn't that pretty. There were much prettier girls in the class. He thought Devon was a little crazy about Heather, though. Devon seemed a little scrambled in general. Mick was beginning to think maybe Devon had picked up a symbiont. There was something in his eyes, something not quite right. "I think justice is payback," Heather said. "Payback," Mr. Gentry repeated. "Yeah," Heather said. "Like, someone disses you, so you have to diss them back." "Payback seems a little vague," Mr. Gentry said. "Perhaps it's too open to interpretation. What if payback goes too far?" Heather shrugged. "Accidents happen." She laughed, and the rest of the class laughed with her. Devon laughed the loudest. Mick noticed Kelsey wasn't laughing. Mick wasn't laughing either. A shiver slithered down his spine. Devon didn't think the day would ever end. Every class was slow and boring, with social studies winning the prize. Except for Heather's hilarious accidents happen comments, the rest of the class had been drier than his mother's roast chicken, which was so dry it was hard to believe the bird had ever been alive at all. But finally, the day was over, and he and Mick were headed to the front of the school to meet Kelsey. The front of the school. How awesome was that? No more sneaking out the back to a clubhouse for losers. Mick trotted up to Devon just inside the main doors of the school. Kids jostled past them, running for buses. For once, Devon didn't find the Friday afternoon buzz in the air annoying. He felt the buzz, too, like little electrical eels skimming over his skin. He noticed that Mick had been acting like he was plugged into a light socket all day. He was jittery and spastic, but Devon understood. He also felt strangely happy about everything. For once, he was enjoying the yellow walls in the school hall, which most of the time reminded him of uncooked egg yolk and made him want to gag. He wasn't minding all the school odors. The chemical smell of the carpet, dusty smell of chalk, the sweat, the bubble gum, and the garlic breath from that day's school lunch. Instead of feeling foreign, it felt familiar. "Are you ready?" Mick asked, plucking at Devon's sleeve. Devon grinned. "Ready." They pushed their way through the double-glass doors and both scanned the driveway for a bright red dually truck. Kelsey had been right, they couldn't miss it. They headed toward it and met up with Kelsey as he trotted over from the gym. "You're here." Kelsey sounded genuinely pleased. Devon was surprised. Kelsey raised a hand and waved at a bearded man behind the wheel of the truck. The man waved back, smiling. Devon wondered what it was like to have an adult male smiling at you. No, seriously, let's tell the truth. He wondered what it would be like to have an adult male, say, like a dad, around, period. The only memory he had of his dad was of an angry man who threw things at his mom. Devon was 3 when his dad took off. He and his mom had been alone ever since. Kelsey led Devon and Mick to the pickup. Devon noticed a few kids give Mick and him looks like they were cavemen who escaped the Stone Age. A paper airplane sailed by Devon's head, barely missing his nose. He didn't bother to turn around and see where it came from. He kept his gaze on the massive red pickup truck. "Hey, George," Kelsey said, when they reached the truck. He and George did an elaborate finger flutter into a shoulder bump. "This is Devon." Kelsey nodded at Devon, "and Mick." "Nice to meet you, sir." Mick thrust out his hand and dropped the books he'd tucked under his arm. Before Devon could reach for them, Kelsey bent down to pick them up. George, who looked to be about a fit 60-something, shook Mick's hand. "No need for this, sir. Call me George." He turned to Devon and offered his hand. Devon shook it. It was thick and calloused. "Hi, George." Kelsey stacked Mick's books and handed them back to Mick. Mick shifted them and grinned. "Thanks." "Okay," George said. "How about—" "Hey, Kelsey." Heather's voice ran out. Devon whirled to look at her. She was wearing a tight, bright red shirt today. He'd spent most of English staring at it, and he was happy to see it again. Heather ignored his stare, but Gabriella gave Devon a heavy-lidded look designed to make him feel like a worm. He made an ugly face at her, and she clutched Quincy, who pulled her close and said to George, "Nice rig." "Thanks," George grinned and patted the hood of his pickup like it was a dog. "I've got a 6.2-liter V8 under the hood here, 420 horsepower and 460 pounds of torque." "Whoa," Quincy said. "Sweet." He leaned against the front of the truck like he was posing for an ad. Gabriella giggled and posed next to him. Devon's jaw clenched. Quincy and Gabriella were the pretty